Hello, everyone. Welcome to Arash's World. We have a special guest today, Patrick Schmidt. How are you doing today?
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
Pretty good. And you know what's coming, and we're going to continue with that tradition. I will ask you to briefly introduce yourself in any way you see fit. And I'm really curious to see what you would say.
Okay, great. Well, again, my name is Patrick Schmidt. I'm an attorney in Washington, D.C., where I focus primarily on international matters relating to Latin America and the Caribbean. Um, a lot of my work in recent years has been on helping islands develop their renewable energy potential, which is very important for them, very important for the world really to have a showcase for how some of this technology can be applied in larger countries. So that was something I was very proud and satisfied to have had the chance to work on. And I went to Harvard College as an undergraduate, and that's where I got interested in intellectual history. Uh, Back then, it was called history of science. It's sort of broader now and called intellectual history, and has a much more uh, firm place in history and in general. It's recognized as in its own right, as a field. Um, so I got interested in history of science. I did some research on an experiment that Harvard started with its social sciences in mid-century. And later, many years later, many decades later, I decided to turn that into a book. And that's what we're going to talk about today.
Yes, yes, wonderful. So you're actually the second attorney back to back that I've had on my podcast, and I sometimes also feel a bit intimidated because I think my words could be used against me at some point. But okay, so the book is Harvard's Chaotic Pursuit of a New Science: The Rise and Fall of the Department of Social Relations. Already for the title, I like the reference to Don Quixote because my thesis was on Don Quixote and Madame Bovary, and my it was a bit odd because I said that literature could become dangerous. Reading could become an issue when it's not channeled properly, so that there's these false notions that we have about truth. And it was called the literal truth and inquiry into novels and reality. And often or sometimes they don't match. So that was my thesis. And when I read the title of your book, it kind of brought some of that into my mind. I might be completely wrong or not, but I'm very interested in that, especially as you're mentioning the research that was done in those years, especially talking about the '60s, and we had the psychedelics and that movement and how it derailed and how things are going back to another path now, which is, I think, better. But again, let's talk about it. So you explained your inspiration for it. So this was something research you had done previously and decided to put it into a book. Let's talk about those experiments and how do you feel about them, and what are some of your conclusions about them?
Well, there are two different sets of experiments
Mhm.
that gained notoriety. The one that happened in real time and that probably is more well known is the research that was done by Timothy Leary,
Yeah.
the great guru of the 1960s, who became well known for his phrase, uh, uh, "Turn on, tune in, drop out."
Yeah.
That was his catchphrase. He came to Harvard in 1959, and at that point, he was a mainstream psychologist. He was working on personality. He was a clinical psychologist, which means he was concerned with helping people in everyday life.
Mhm.
It wasn't just some abstract sort of research. It was applied sort of psychology. And he was brought to Harvard in 1959 to get things going, in the words of the faculty member who brought him in. And of course, he did get things going, but not quite in the way
They had
that's
envisioned, right? They
they
had
had
envisioned
envisioned,
something
right?
completely different. Yeah.
So he came to Harvard in 1959, as I said, um, very charismatic fellow, well-liked, but he immediately started doing research that was not, shall we say, well-controlled. It wasn't very rigorous research. And then that summer, after he had started at Harvard, he went down to Mexico and he tried the magic mushrooms for the first time. And this was a revelation to him. He thought this was something that could help mankind. It could solve many of mankind's problems, not just sort of individuals who had psychological problems. And he was just convinced that this was the future of the world. So when he came back, he said, I'm going to study this at Harvard. And he started something called the Harvard Psilocybin Project. And that he basically had three different types of experiments that he did. One was he gave, and I should tell you how he got a hold of the psilocybin. Because it was impractical to give the mushroom to people. So what had happened was there was a drug company called Sandoz who synthesized the active ingredient in the magic mushroom. And Leary sent a letter off to Sandoz on Harvard stationery asking if he could get a supply of the synthesized drug for his research. That's all he said. And they sent him a huge bottle. It was much bigger than that, a huge supply of the psilocybin, and said, well, good luck and let us know how it goes. It was not a very scientific exchange. I mean, it was all quite loose. So he had this.
Could we consider that like a sample? They're giving like, try.
No, it wasn't. It was a huge supply. I mean, he used it for years. I mean, giving out.
He paid for it? Was that like business transaction?
No, I don't. He didn't even pay for it.
Okay,
I mean,
so large sample.
Yeah. I mean, just said here, because he was at Harvard. I guess they thought, okay, well, this is great. Some Harvard guy is researching using our drug, so more power to him.
And at the point we want to point out, the drugs were still legal.
Yes. LSD also. Nobody really knew, or the general public was not aware of psychedelic drugs yet. This was 59, now 60. And
but they were doing research on various drugs at the time still, right? They were using not these ones, not specifically, but other types of drugs. Were they doing research, or is that like just completely new terrain for everyone?
I don't know if other people were doing some research on other psychedelic drugs. I think he was one of the first to really dive deeply into it.
I mean, Freud used cocaine, and he was open about it at the time. So the view of drugs.
If you look back, and having a look back and take a expansive definition of drugs. Mm-hmm. Even William James, the famous revered Harvard professor, he was I think it was nitrous oxide. He was inhaling that to get a high, and then his visions he would write about it. Aldous Huxley, who eventually was at MIT, he also was, I think his drug of choice was mescaline.
Yeah.
And he wrote The Doors of Perception.
Yeah.
If you have that title right. And Huxley and Leary met up. I mean,
they did.
If Leary started to do his research, Huxley was down the street really at MIT. So they got together for lunch, and Leary said, hey, I'm going to start doing this research. What do you think? And Huxley was, at the beginning, he thought it was a good idea, but then he became a bit disenchanted with Leary because he was not as rigorous in his research as he might be. Yeah. But so those people connected, and it's interesting at Harvard, William James, using a drug to expand his consciousness, so to speak, and then Leary, 60 years later, was doing the same thing, and when Leary was attacked for his research, he invoked the name of William James.
Oh no!
He said, no, Harvard should be doing this. It should be proud it's doing this. because it's in the tradition of William James. So
there are some theories that the ancient Greeks also might have used similar types of drugs to get intoxicated, to get those grand ideas and the consciousness. I mean, it's not really proven, but there are some theories about that. So it's been going on in the tradition closely linked to philosophy and psychology and expansion of the mind. But what went wrong? Is it like, was Timothy Leary overzealous? Was he just like, what did it affect him as well? I mean, we see studies with psychologists who fall who get caught up in their studies, like Zimbardo, who got confused about like, this is an experiment, but he took it very seriously. Is that something that happened to Timothy Leary as well? Would you think that he just got like swept away and sidetracked of like what the goal was actually?
Well, as I mentioned, from the very beginning, he just really believed that this was a solution to many problems. So in that sense, he was a true believer. But he also, you're correct, he ingested a lot of the drugs. And that was one of the criticisms of him at Harvard, is that he was taking the drugs with the subjects sometimes in these very loose, informal settings where he gave the drugs to people. So that was one of the criticisms. And I would also I should mention his partner in this was Richard Alpert, who later became known as Ram Dass, Baba Ram Dass. Alpert was already at Harvard, but he became totally, as I said in the book, beguiled by Timothy Leary. He just thought, he was sort of charmed by him. And he along with Leary, were doing these experiments. And so it was not just Leary, but Leary and Alpert, and they were both criticized for taking a lot of the drugs. And there was a large conference, in fact, one of the most important conferences on personality, psychology, and I think it was in Denmark. And Leary and Alpert spoke at the conference, and they were praising psychedelic drugs as a solution. And a lot of the people in the audience said it was pretty clear they were both high at the time on the drug. We'll never know for sure, but that was the reaction of some of the people in the audience,
Yeah, that's really fascinating. But there was also the dark side of some of those experiments with Henry Murray, who did the experiment with who would become the Unabomber, Theodore Kaczynski. And so, was there? How did that happen? Was there not enough oversight, or did not? I mean, you have to go through the process of getting those studies approved. Is that correct?
Well, we have to put it in the context of the time. At the in the late 1950s, early 60s, there really weren't.
There was no ethics board at that time, right? The Zimbardo, who I think really pushed the limits. So I think after him, where you had to get approval and all that, right? So it was more loose and free to do whatever they wanted, basically.
Yeah, there were what was known as the Nuremberg rule or regulation, that you needed to get the consent of the people you were doing the research on. You needed to explain what it was you were doing and get their consent. That was really the only sort of rule that was out there at the time. And but in the case of Henry Murray, he even violated that rule because at the time, Ted Kaczynski, brilliant, he got into Harvard when he was 16 years old. He was a genius in math and science. And when he was recruited by Murray to do this experiment, he was 17. And so Murray needed to get Kaczynski's mother's permission to do the experiment. But he didn't explain to his mother what the experiment was about. He just said something very vague about, this is to help understand mankind better, or something very vague, which of course was not what the experiment was about at all. And that was very sad, because his mother thought by giving permission, this might help her son, which she acknowledged he was very shy. He had problems adjusting. And she thought, oh, these nice psychologists are going to help my son. And of course, nothing could be further from the truth in what actually happened. So we have to put it in context of the time. There weren't really the regulations there are now, but even so, Murray violated the one rule that was out there. So, sadly.
The experiment, I've seen bits of it, or I've read about it, and it's just like horrifying. And it just I don't understand how especially a psychologist would do something like that. I understand it's for the science and you're trying to push limits. Even like Milgram, okay, I kind of understand what he's trying to show us there about understanding human nature, but there has to be a certain amount of like limits and empathy for the subjects. And I really don't understand how they didn't. And this went on for 3 years, the experiment,
Yeah.
which is like, at some point you do have to realize that there's something off, or, in conversations with others, with colleagues and so on. And so I'm wondering if there was also government research done with the CIA. I mean, I know they were very interested in the drugs and the psychedelics and these kind of experiments to see what they can do with it, maybe as a truth serum, or maybe, as being able to read minds and telekinesis and that kind of stuff. Is that documented that there was also a push from the government to research it with hand in hand with Harvard?
Well, as far as Henry Murray goes, there was very, very definitely a government connection.
I thought so,
which dates back to World War II. He was one of the principal psychologists for the Office of Strategic Services, which was the precursor to the CIA. And his main research then, and his contribution to the war effort, was how do you break down a spy? Like if we captured a spy, how do you break them down? Or how do you test our recruits to see who would make a good spy? Who could withstand tough interrogation tactics. So this was his field of study at the CIA, which he was starting, back in the early 1940s. Well, this was the same research he was doing in the late 50s at Harvard, except he was using students. He was doing this research. How do you break people down?
Yeah.
That's what it was all about. And so now I don't know that at the time I don't believe he was working with the CIA in the late 1950s with respect to the research he did at Harvard. I'm sure he was in contact with them, but I don't think there was a link. In fact, there doesn't seem to be any link. He didn't publish his work. His assistants, research assistants, said he had no plan to publish his research. It was very, there wasn't really an agenda in terms of what he was going to do with the research.
Well, what was the point then?
Well, it's unclear what he was going to do with it. One of his research assistants said that Professor Murray was not the most systematic scientist. So now maybe he had a plan in his mind for what he was going to do with the research, publish it or whatever. But at the time, his research assistants were unaware of any sort of goal, with that particular research. So, and all of this, I should say, came out much later, unlike Timothy Leary, which got in the New York Times, sort of was a springboard to opening the eyes of America to psychedelic drugs. That's what this department and this research and Timothy Leary did. I mean, Harvard was kind of the launching pad in a lot of ways for the counterculture, the 1960s. Henry Murray, that didn't come out until 1990, in the 1992 or thereabouts, or 1996, somewhere in the 1990s, it came out that he was doing this research.
There should have been more oversight, though, at this point.
Well, yeah. I mean, at the time, again, there was not much regulation. So it was quite an eye-opener when this came out in the 90s that Murray had done this research. And of course, Ted Kaczynski then had been, captured, and it became an issue in his trial. His brother, who turned in Ted Kaczynski, wrote about the experiments and what Harvard had done. And I'm not saying that Henry Murray created the Unabomber. I'm not saying that at all. We don't know what effect it had on Kaczynski. He called it the worst experience of his life. That's the way he referred to it. And he also said in the last year of the experiment, he said that coincided with his disillusionment with society. Mm-hmm. So we know we have those statements, but so I'm not saying at all Murray created the Unabomber. It's just, it was quite a traumatic experience, and it was an unfortunate experience that happened. And it was, these two incidents of research were they were black eyes for this department. Mm-hmm. And they really created this image of the department that it was a bit loose in terms of its approach to the academy, to research, and so on and so forth. So it also detracted from the main goal of the department, which was just try to find a new science to study human behavior. And these were distractions, unfortunate distractions, and they ultimately helped hasten the downfall of the department because, well, not Murray because it happened afterwards, but Leary was a black eye that people at Harvard were questioning, well, what's going on with this department? What's going on over there with these
and it's unfortunate because it really backfired, and you have this like drive, and I think Huxley was, or even like people around him were not happy with that. Say, let's keep it for our research. Let's not open it up to the public, and that's actually the move currently too, where they want to decriminalize it, not legalize it, but decriminalize it in Oregon, and they're doing the this new initiative. I think ballot measure 109, that it becomes legal to use psychedelics, or especially magic mushrooms, to do for research for therapeutic uses. And it does have that, and that's documented. And I watched recently How to Change Your Mind, Michael Pollan's documentary, which is amazing. Yeah. And so I knew a lot of this already myself, and I do have personal experiences with some of those substances that I can relate to. And I think, but we don't want to use it recreationally. We don't want to open it up as we did the same mistake that Timothy Leary did. And I think at that point, I mean, it's easy to judge now from our point of view and what we see now from our vantage point. But I think it's really important to really study and research it first, and then kind of open it up if possible for others. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I agree. And I would also point out the great irony is that Harvard has recently started to study again psilocybin. Yeah. There's a project that Harvard is doing at Massachusetts General Hospital. It's called, if I just want to make sure I get the name of it correctly, but it's a
Center for Neuroscience, is that
the Center for Neuroscience of Psychedelics?
Yeah.
Mass General, and it's a Harvard Medical School professor, Jeffrey Rosenbaum, who's heading it. So I think Timothy Leary would find this all quite funny that all these years later, now Harvard is researching, but they're doing the research in the way it should be done. I mean,
should have been done as well. Yeah.
And there is a great irony still, though, that Harvard is undertaking this. And there's some criticism of Leary in the sense that he set research back because he went off in a way that was not controlled, and there created a lot of stigma with these drugs. So researchers then stayed away from it longer than they might have otherwise. That's one line of argument against another line of argument against Leary, that he actually, although he had a vision for how it could be helpful, he created this stigma around the drugs, and it kept researchers away from it longer than they otherwise might have have done. So
yeah, it backfired again. And Berkeley also has a center for the science of psychedelics, and where they actually have like training programs. Apart from research, they train professionals to use it in a variety of different fields. And so it's really opened up in that sense that we're doing research. So do you think that this time around we will all get it right? They will get it right. Are you hopeful, or do you think it could get derailed and sidetracked again?
no, I mean, look, I think if you have institutions like Berkeley, Harvard, others, New York University, I believe Johns Hopkins is also researching this. So look, these are some of the best research institutions in the world, and the medical schools are now involved. That's the other thing. I mean, Leary was not a medical doctor, okay? And I think when you're looking at these substances that affect your brain, I mean, it's important to have the medical schools involved in it. And so I think it's all I'm not a scientist, but when you have research institutions of this caliber looking at it with the standards that they have, I mean, I think this is the way it should be done. And yeah, I'm hopeful that something good will come out of it, particularly for things like post-traumatic stress disorder, all sorts of things. There's encouraging research in that area among others.
And it's also politically there. It's also very hopeful because both sides of the aisles are actually approving it for different reasons. But we also have the right, who is funding a lot of the research too, in terms of for veterans for post-traumatic disorders. So in that sense, and I think it's really important to unite and bridge the differences and create that common ground of making sure that we do research, we do it properly, and not to alienate others. And so at this point, it's rare to have that kind of common ground. And that's a question I asked Michael Pollan at a press conference. And he said, yes, this is like one of those rare instances where we agree with each other. And I think we should further that and not alienate others, but just make sure that everybody's on board, so that we take away maybe the Schedule 1 like substance, the drug that's really dangerous, and kind of try to get rid of that stigma that was that built on it for various decades now. And if we look at just at the beginning of marijuana, for example, reefer madness and those kind of like propaganda that was going on, misrepresenting facts and science back then and scaring off people from these substances, and now it's legal. Well, in Canada, it's legal, and it's confusing. I understand people would say, well, how is this a substance that was illegal for such a long time that causes all this harm to my mind and body and everything, and now it's fine, and you can buy it from the government? So this is very confusing. That kind of shift of getting rid of the stigma.
Yeah. But I think things are, as I said, it's in the hands of some very capable research institutions, and it's getting the scrutiny it deserves. But it's also the stigma is lifting. I mean, you have people like Pollan and his books and his speaking. So yeah,
there's the overzealousness, that enthusiasm is still there. I mean, I watched the program, and it's like a lot of it I agree with and I can relate to based again on personal experiences. But the way it's presented, like you do it once and you're healed of your trauma and you cure, it doesn't really work that way. So it's like there's like a lot of optimism going around too, and we have to just keep it in balance and make sure that yes, it is powerful. It can help, but it also takes patience and work, and it's not going to lead to immediate success. I think we have to remind ourselves, but it didn't seem like that. It was more like, seems like advertisement for it. And then at some point, the last episode seemed to go into political discussions, and it was politicized. And although I agree with the issues raised, but I could see people being alienated by that and saying, wait, oh, they're trying to brainwash me, or it's, an agenda here. And I think we should really focus just on the science and the benefits that it can bring, and just forget all the rest about it. I know there's been abuse, and it came from Mexico and it affected those towns. It's true. But let's not let's just focus on the good parts where we can unite everyone. And I was a bit let down by that approach, of trying to educate while you also trying to convince people, while you also try. It's like trying to juggle too many things, and I don't think it would work necessarily.
Yeah. Well, I think with anything new, it takes a while for the things to sort of shake out and settle
Mhm.
down. And
Mhm.
and the public, the pendulum kind of goes
Yes, it does.
back and
Yes,
forth
it
very
does.
quickly and far too easily. And there's so much disinformation and misinformation
Yes.
out there that it'll take a while for things to shake out and for the facts to really take hold. But again, I'm confident with the research that's being done with by these institutions, by people as grounded as Pollan, that yeah, I think the facts will out. Whether whichever way that goes,
Mhm.
it's on a good trajectory at the moment. But yeah, so it'll take a while. But you're right. I mean, the the public just swings back and forth far too easily on this and many other things.
Within instance sometimes, yeah, that's
Yeah,
true.
yeah.
And but you talk about rise and fall, and would you say that it's again rise again? So because would that note be included in your observations that yes, we tried the experiment in Department of Social Relations, we tried the interdisciplinary department, and is it like a reboot now where we can make it better, or do you think that again Don Quixote comes to mind? Do you think this is a futile attempt? We're trying something like Captain Ahab trying to grab Moby Dick and never does, or do you think that it's possible? We just have to fine tune it enough.
Well, on my choice of quixotic for the
Mm-hmm.
title, the reason I chose that is because, I mean, some people see quixotic as a pejorative term, but I see it as meaning something that is idealistic,
Okay, I like that.
but unrealistic,
I like that too.
noble, but unrealistic. And
Yeah.
I think that's what these Harvard professors were trying to do. This was the end of World War II. There had been a lot of research during World War II where these different social scientists worked together: cultural anthropologists, sociologists,
Mhm.
psychologists. They worked together on issues of, trying to figure out the morale of the
Mhm.
Japanese.
Mhm.
Like if we did X, what would the Japanese do? Or what would the Germans do? What would Hitler do? They were doing from afar, they were trying to figure out these, big questions. And it also even went down to, how do you sell war bonds? How do you convince the public to buy war bonds? So they,
Mhm.
all of a sudden, this was a big change in mid-century America, that all of a sudden psychologists, anthropologists, sociologists were like a big deal. They were becoming a big deal. Before they were kind of, they were not really paid a great attention to, but now they were contributing to the war effort. And when the war ended, a lot of these professors who had been involved in the war effort said, "Hey, we don't need these different departments separated from one another.
Mhm.
We
Mhm.
should all work together. That's
Yeah.
how we generate progress."
Mhm.
And of course, they were also, some of these people were very unhappy in the existing departments, particularly psychology,
Mhm.
because there were a huge fight between the two camps, the two different types of psychologists at Harvard. So they proposed this department, and Harvard agreed to do it in 1946. So, but they hadn't really thought it through. I mean, if you're going to create a new science, which is what they promised, a science that would be more important than history, government, and economics in explaining human behavior, you better have more of a theoretical foundation, which they didn't have. They
Mhm.
had a great idea. They had some internal memos that they had done, but they didn't have enough to really create a department. And then they did try with a lot of money from the Carnegie Endowment, a huge sum of money, then they 3 years after the department was founded, they tried to create this theory, and they spent 2 to 3 years researching and writing, and that book they produced also failed. I mean, they just couldn't put these different pieces together in a way that made sense. So once that failed in 1951, that book came out, they basically just continued as a department, many departments within one department. It was like, okay, you had the psychologist here, the anthropologist here, and they didn't really work together that much. But because they had all these superstars of the 20th century, social sciences, Harvard, kind of let it go. And the professors were happy. They were still doing great work. I'm not denigrating any of them. They did incredible work, but it just wasn't interdisciplinary. It was more multidisciplinary.
Yeah, exactly.
Which was not the goal, which is not the goal.
Something I've gotten into very much is a holistic view. And I think it's really important, and we can apply that to departments like that. So in terms of, because there is that competition, because the psychologists like, oh, we are right. And then the economists would say, no, we are correct. And so to find it like these are parts, and then we want to look at the whole and kind of unity among the different parts. So as you're saying, instead of make it interdisciplinary and work together on that common ground, those bridges that we need to cross. And that will help everyone. And I think like science is catching up, and the theory of like trying to have one theory for everything is tough. And you have things that Einstein says that are 100 years later proven correct. And we're still lagging with Sigmund Freud, and I think he's correct on many, many issues. And it's just also, we talk about unconscious bias, and I just like smile and think, well, Freud would have a field day too, and he would laugh and say, these are things that I talked about more than 100 years ago, and now you're finally acknowledging it. In terms of science too, it's proven there is that unconscious part of the brain. So I think it's that openness also to go in a direction that you thought was wrong as a scientist, but you say, well, there is evidence, and we have to switch our paradigm and shift it in the direction that is correct. And science is constantly evolving, right? You don't have to stick to the same idea, and you shouldn't, obviously. We want to learn new things about human nature, especially, and that's hard to study to begin with.
Yeah. And there are, I think it's very hard to do something that's truly interdisciplinary. There is, like biochemistry, for example, is a field. There's behavioral economics now, which uses some elements of psychology in it. But it's really difficult to have something that's truly interdisciplinary. That doesn't mean you shouldn't try. It just in the context of a university setting, well, okay, how do you structure that? Is it better just to let the professors work together if they choose to work together, instead of trying to incorporate it in an academic structure like a department, or some universities do it in an institute, and a lot of universities kind of throw the term around interdisciplinary without really thinking through, okay, what does this really mean? What are we really trying to do? Is it just sound good? We'll put interdisciplinary on it and call it a day. So there's a whole element to that in terms of the academy and what universities should do or shouldn't do with respect to these sorts of ventures. And but in terms of what was done with the Department of Social Relations, they still did great work and had great faculty, but yeah, it just didn't work out.
But we've been having specialization, so we're becoming more and more specific, and the idea of a Renaissance man does not exist anymore at this time. It's impossible because of the wealth of knowledge that we do have. But I think we have to switch that too, and saying like, not just like just dig into your own field, but have a wider picture and a wider lens of seeing other fields as well that you can incorporate. And it's I think it's more also a shift in paradigms of seeing the world differently, of more like instead of just focusing on one thing, of seeing the whole picture. And I think that's important to do, although both are valid and both are important, but we're missing out on the whole picture thing. And that kind of drive, as you say, idealistic but unrealistic. I think there might be a chance. We have to try. We have to try to figure out whether it's possible or not. And and you seem to encourage that, and I completely agree. And I think we can. We're just missing perhaps a piece of the puzzle that will come to us through somehow aliens, whatever. Somehow we will get that missing piece, and then but to keep looking for it. I think that's
well, I would say this, that on a positive note, I would say that some of the students that were trained by the department, people who got their PhD in that from the Department of Social Relations, they incorporated this approach in their research. So there was a benefit, and there was a kind of a life after the department, because and I will mention a very well-known professor at Harvard Graduate School of Education, Howard Gardner, who was an undergraduate at Harvard in social relations. Then he went and got his PhD also in the department. He's a social psychologist, cognitive psychologist, developmental psychologist, brilliant man. And he incorporates this kind of holistic approach.
Yeah, he does.
Okay, so there were benefits from this department, and you can.
But he was frowned upon. He wasn't accepted. They didn't say it's not scientific, but there was criticism of this point of view. To my knowledge,
but I think in terms of individual researchers who kind of, they came out of social relations with this mindset of, okay, we've got to try to bring in what we can from these different disciplines, and they put it together in their own research. So, there was no interdisciplinary science, but individuals kind of became interdisciplinary in their own minds. What I'm trying to say.
Yeah, absolutely.
Howard Gardner is a perfect example of that, and he talks about the influence of this approach in his research, and he credits the department for giving him that. He credits particular professors, David Reisman, who was a very important professor to me, a well-known sociologist. Professor Gardner credits Jerome Bruner, the father of the cognitive revolution, and Eric Erikson, the lay analyst, who was also on the faculty of social relations. So these were men who were definitely interdisciplinary in their approach. Yes. But it was within their own minds that they were interdisciplinary. They didn't work with others and create a science, but their approach was definitely interdisciplinary. And that may be where the continuing benefit is in this.
And we see that now with multiple intelligences and emotional intelligence. And this is like, intelligence is a topic that people are very uncomfortable with when it comes to themselves. As a parent too, I know it's like, okay, intelligent, my son is intelligent, is not intelligent. And so those kind of, we're very concerned about that. So then we do have the genetic view. They say, yeah, it's all genetics and so on. It's mostly genetics at least. And then psychologists say, no, it's really the environment, but both are right. And it's again that kind of common ground. It's like, yes, you are right, now let's work together and come up with a unified theory where both are correct, but again, it depends.
And that was the problem, one of the big problems at Harvard in the 1920s and the 1930s, particularly in the psychology department, because you had the prevailing view of psychology at that time was experimental psychology or behavioral psychology, and that you could only study what you could measure.
Yes.
Therefore, the unconscious was off the table. We could not even think about it because you couldn't measure it. Well, that was completely the opposite of what Henry Murray, Gordon Allport, what we think of psychology now. We think of it's completely focused on the unconscious and your fears, your phobias, all those things. But at the time, in the 20s and 30s, psychology was primarily experimental psychology. So B.F. Skinner, who was a graduate student in psychology at Harvard at the time, for example, if there's an anecdote about him that if somebody even started to talk about the unconscious around B.F. Skinner, he would pretend like he didn't hear them.
Yeah.
It was a version of this, I mean, that's how much disdain he had for any discussion of the unconscious.
Because it goes counter to what he was talking about, because if it's true, then all his theories don't work necessarily, So it's that kind of fear also. It's like, I hope it's not true. Let's not pay attention to it. I'm psychoanalyzing Skinner here.
There was this either or. Okay, it has to be all behavioral psychology, or it has to be all what we call, clinical psychology or psychoanalysis, and no, I mean they both have things to offer, and but at Harvard the lines were clearly drawn, and that was part of the problem. And these psychologists weren't even speaking to each other. They were in the same department, and they weren't even speaking to each other.
And so that's the same department, right? So that's the same department. And then we talk about interdisciplinary department, where they're from different departments. So that's why we see how it's failing, right? It's hard to do.
At least in the interdisciplinary approach, everybody sort of had the same, they were from different disciplines, but they at least agreed to try to make it interdisciplinary. Psychology at Harvard in the 20s and 30s there was no agreement. I mean, you could even say they hated each other. The people like B.F. Skinner looked at somebody like Henry Murray as kind of a mystic, a cultist. I mean, what are you doing? That's voodoo. You're trying to figure out what's in somebody's mind, and that's not scientific. What are you doing at Harvard? What are you doing as a professor at all? I mean, that's the way they viewed that. Those were the battle lines at Harvard. And so the only solution, or part of the solution, was for these psychologists to, like Henry Murray and the people who were interested in the unconscious, to go into a separate department altogether, just split the psychologists from one another. And that's part of what Harvard did.
And psychoanalysis split in many different parts and sections as well. And so I find it interesting because Otto Rank, the secretary, British secretary of Freud, became a psychoanalyst analyst as well, and started criticizing Freud, which was, again, and Freud got upset and just kind of like booted him out. It's like, anybody who trained under Otto Rank it's not valid anymore. And it was just like really nasty. But the point was actually pretty good. The point that Otto Rank makes, he says, we're using introspection as psychoanalysts to get to a certain knowledge about the self, and then we unify it in a theory, and then we project that onto our patients or clients. And so, but we don't take into account their own introspection. So it's like you get something by looking at yourself, you come up with a theory, and that theory is that everybody has to follow that theory. You just don't give credit to that person's experiences, internal experiences and reflections and introspection. So it's really hard to do, and it's not helping the other person, because that's what worked for you, and again, a holistic view, but it might not be working for the other person. And that makes it hard to. So what Otto Rank talks about is the soul. We need to look at the soul, though he didn't believe in the soul, to my knowledge, but he said we should be striving for that. And that brings to mind what you're saying, the idealistic, although it might not exist, but we still need to look for it. And Otto Rank has a very similar view of that. It's like psyche is the soul, and that's what we should be looking for. And Freud was too much into biology. He was kind of the Skinner type of psychoanalyst. And then Jung was too religious and too open. And again, that becomes a bit wishy-washy if you take it in the extreme direction. And it should be somewhere in between.
Yeah. And it's really I discuss this in the book, that it's hard to imagine now that the Freudian language, Jungian language, is so much part of our lexicon.
Yes, it
like
is.
we talk about the id, the superego,
Mm-hmm.
Oedipus complex, all these things. They're second nature. Everybody uses them in their language. But in the 1920s and the 30s, this was revolutionary.
Yes.
I mean, and so controversial. What Freud was doing, what Jung was doing, it's hard to imagine just how controversial it was at the time. So that's why these battles were so fierce.
Yeah.
And Henry Murray had undergone analysis with Jung himself. I mean, they and Alpert had met Freud. These people were there at the beginning of this, you know, and so yeah, it's really hard. It's hard to imagine now the fury that this caused within the academy, because all of a sudden you had this sleepy psychology, and then all of a sudden Freud burst on the scene, turning everything upside down.
Yes.
And there was a lot of resistance to that.
And
that's what caused these fierce fights at Harvard, even more than any other university, frankly. So
no, that's wonderful. I just want also one final question I'd like to ask you is, how does this book and your research fit into your work and your profession, or it doesn't? Is it like something else, like as being an attorney, and how does that fit into your overall goals, aims, and so on? Or is it a kind of side project, a passion project of yours?
No, it's really a passion project.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah.
I mean, my work as a lawyer, I like to think of myself as being interdisciplinary in my approach as a lawyer, because I work on things that have elements other than just the law in them. I've worked on speech writing for some of my clients. I help write white papers for my clients. I help them, with their image internationally. So I try to be interdisciplinary in my approach, but it really, there's no connection between the two. I just love intellectual history. I thought what these men, and at the time it was all men, I have to say, back in the 20s and 30s, I have great respect for them, and what Harvard was trying to do. It didn't work out, but it was still a valuable attempt. But really, there's no connection with my legal work. No,
and that's wonderful, and that's, again, as you say, interdisciplinary, and I highly applaud that, and thank you for doing that. The book is, again, Harvard's Quixotic or Quixotic. The Spanish. You speak Spanish, by the way?
Yes, I do.
Okay,
I lived in Spain for a time. So.
Oh, wonderful. So Harvard's Quixotic Pursuit of a New Science, the rise and fall of the Department of Social Relations. We are looking at Harvard. We talk about the history. Such an awesome discussion, enlightening discussion. And thank you so much for being on Rash's World.
Thank you for having me. It was wonderful. A great pleasure.
Thank you.